Hi, everyone. My name is Rachel Moszkowicz. I am an intern with the Climate Mental Health Network, and I am joined today by Anya Kamenetz. And we are discussing our new climate change and kids' well-being guide for parents and other caring adults. And we're going to take you through the guide and tell you what's in it, tell you how to use it. And I'll let Anya give a little introduction.
Thanks, Rachel. Yeah, we're really excited to be unveiling this guide today. It's something that's both Rachel and I have been working on for a long time with the support of Oregon State University. We conducted national focus groups with parents about what they're facing as far as climate emotions with themselves and with their kids. And with that as our guidance, as well as lots of feedback and input from many, many different amazing experts from many different walks of life across the country. We put together this guide and we're hoping that it is useful for people that need it. And of course, you can access it online at climatementalhealth.net. But this is going to be a little bit of an audio overview for people that prefer to listen, because that's one thing that parents told us.
Amazing. And I think what's great about this guide is there's lots of different entry points to be able
Yes.
to access it. So whether, you haven't started the conversation around climate change and climate emotions with your kids before, you might not even have kids at this point, but are considering having children, what that means in this climate changing world. We have, sections for older kids. We have sections on managing climate feelings, surviving extreme weather. So just a whole kind of range where you can really access like where you're coming to this conversation.
Yes, that's exactly right. So let's dive in. And the beginning of the guide is a sort of overview. Don't know how to start. And uh, what's important to understand here is that climate change and extreme weather are already affecting our children's physical and mental health. Where I am right now in New York City, there's an air quality alert because of wildfires in Canada. So I had to assess and talk to my husband this morning. Do we go to the beach? Do we spend time outside? So this is an everyday stressor, whether our kids are explicitly aware of it or not. We know that this is impacting them. It's impacting families. One very striking statistic is that 3 out of 5 parents of young children have already experienced at least one extreme weather event in the past 2 years. So this is something that is very much impacting us in the here and now.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. I know for me, I'm in Southern California. We're getting fire alerts on our phone um, constantly. And of course, there was just the Palisades and Altadena fires not that long ago. And we're seeing, the emotional impact is affecting very young children as well, who are noticing when, a sky is turning bright orange because of wildfires. They're noticing that they can't go outside and build snowmen in the winters like they used to. Um, so people of all, ages are really picking up on the subtle changes and the extreme weather we are experiencing. And a good place to start that we outlined in the guide in terms of kind of recognizing what emotions we're feeling around this is the climate emotions wheel, which Anya, do you want to speak a little on the wheel?
Sure. And I just want to, connect the dots here, right? So these events are happening, they're in the news, their causes can be very complex, but there's a misconception that we can sort of avoid talking about them or getting to the details with kids. And the reason that that's a misconception is that if it's something that's stressing us out as parents and that we haven't dealt with, it's going to come into our relationship with our kids. And as our kids get a little older, by the time they start school, they're already receiving messages about the earth and what's happening to the earth and living creatures. And it can snowball into really extreme forms of anxiety and depression. And that's what we're seeing happening with Gen Z right now.
Mhm.
So, what we're trying to do with this guide is really build the building blocks of emotional literacy around climate change so that it doesn't have to be so scary. There are ways to cope, there are ways to thrive. And when it comes into the conversation, when we start to be able to face our own climate emotions as parents or caregivers, as well as handle our kids' climate emotions, that's how we start to become a more healthy society that's able to cope.
Mhm.
And so the climate emotions wheel is based on the research of Panu Pikala, who's a researcher in Finland, and compiled from 14 different studies from around the world of the emotions that people name in relationship to climate change. And then we have this translated into multiple different languages. There's an emoji version for young children. And so, basically what's a need to know right now is that, of course, there's different flavors of anger, grief and sadness, fear and overwhelm and anxiety. And what's also on the wheel, of course, is positivity. Rachel, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I think so much of the conversation around climate change and our emotions, um, it tends to be really centered around these more quote unquote negative emotions, such as anger and anxiety and grief. And of course, those are real, those are valid. What we're also seeing, though, is that there is such a range of emotional experience that people are having in relationship to climate change. That there's also feelings of curiosity and gratitude and hope when we just really think about, this really beautiful, amazing planet we are living on. And what we found is a lot of the parents were talking about how their children are expressing curiosity about the environment, about climate change, about what is happening. They're really wanting to understand it. Um, and, this is discussed in the guide at one point, but there's so many ways to be able to connect your children's interests and curiosities um, to climate change. And that's a way to start the conversation. And so I think the climate emotions wheel is such a great tool, an accessible tool for people of all ages to use and to recognize too that our feelings, at least, mine around shift constantly around climate change. They could look
Yes.
really differently at different points.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And it's important to understand that, engaging in this exploration with our kids, it can bring us closer together as families. And it can also, there's research actually that shows this, that when parents embrace the challenges of climate change and we follow our children's interest and curiosity, it can be a catalyst for personal growth and meaning and even hope. So it's a beautiful journey. And I want to start, we start for people that don't even have kids yet. And Rachel, you're getting married. I don't know what you're thinking about as far as starting a family, but the reason that we start there is, I mean, maybe you can speak to this. I mean, climate anxiety is often popping up as we're thinking about starting a family.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's something I feel like I thought a lot about in my early 20s and have had lots of conversations with my friends around this because I think, especially the climate education I received as kind of a Gen Z millennial was kind of more so this like apocalyptic messaging of, humanity is kind of doomed and there's so much going wrong. How could we possibly bring children into this world? And that's something I think a lot of us young people carry. Um, I will say my kind of views around this have really shifted in part to due to the work of Britt Ray
Mm.
and her book Gen Dread. But I think there's real, reproductive anxieties around climate and what it means to bring children into this world. And of course, it's a deeply um, personal decision. but I think learning about all that is being done around climate and how there's still so much joy and purpose and connection to find among others has really shifted some of those feelings for me. So I think it's
That's really
yeah, an important place to start.
absolutely, absolutely. And yeah, it's a very, very personal process, but I just wanted to acknowledge that as starting out. And it's part of it's part of what it means to embark on your life right now, right?
Mhm. Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
and segueing into that for people that have very young children, we have, the beginning of the guide. And the nice thing about sort of starting early, of course, is you can always lay the groundwork for more complicated conversations later.
Mhm.
But the good news is that the foundations of things like extreme weather safety, climate literacy, are things that every young child needs to grow up happy and healthy. So we call out sort of, how we're teaching basic co-regulation of emotions, how we're teaching our children to self-soothe, how we're teaching basic social emotional literacy, right? Understanding and expressing and managing and naming our emotions is something that we teach in preschool. Another thing that early childhood is really known for is showing very basic care of self and care of environment. So we start to teach our kids about, we wear a hat, we wear sunscreen, we keep our body cool when it's hot.
Mhm.
And care of environment, this is something my child's Montessori was really wonderful at. We care for animals and plants around us, and we also don't waste water, don't waste food. So these are the ways, these are the little planting of the seeds of messaging. And I had a story from a childhood educator who talked to me about how they were kind of putting, inculcating that in their kids. And they had a little boy who was just over 1 year old, and he pointed at a bug that was upside down and said, "Oh no!" And he got his father to pick up the bug. And our children just really have that innate biophilia for the natural world, and so this is where we start. You might not think of that as climate literacy or climate education, but it's everywhere, and there's always opportunities for it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think even being able to listen to the messages that our bodies are telling us, are we too hot? Are we too cold? Is so important. And yeah, just having that connection to the place where we're living and our home and what the environment means and how, I'm a part of it. I'm a part of that system.
Yeah,
And taking care of myself is taking care of the environment. There's so much you could do with early education to kind
yeah.
of establish the root of being a caring climate being.
Absolutely, absolutely. And then as we start to go into the school age, I mean, the core of our initial version of this parent resources, this is a really big update of our guide, but it's talking about it in terms of a talk, a conversation. And we know that this is not just one conversation, and that's why we expanded into this whole guide. But we do sort of provide a script that you can use, whether there's something in the news that they're curious about or something they learned about in school, to spark that conversation. And we have, a multi-step way of getting into it, talking about what's unique about the Earth, how the Earth is actually changing right now, how the amount of carbon dioxide in the air and other gases can be like a blanket. Too many
Mhm.
blankets can make you feel too hot, like you have a fever. And then, of course, we know why this is happening. This is happening because of emissions. And then, of course, having, space for emotions, and of course, talking about solutions, big scale solutions, as well as very personal solutions, and giving kids ways to take action.
Mhm. And I think an important note too is we have such negativity bias in our brains, and the media as well really understands this. And we're fed a lot of really upsetting stories. And obviously, there is a lot to be upset about when it comes to climate change. But there are so many solutions and stories of hope, and making sure we're really, balancing that. and it,
Yes, thank you for underlining that. And I think it's just it's really, really palpable right now because I just think that I mean, climate education is under emphasized in general in the United States, but even more than climate education is climate solutions education. So there's a lot of research that shows that kids just don't know that much about all the things that are being done to combat these problems. And I think right now it's such a palpable contrast because while we see that there's a dismantling of climate related regulations and programs here in the United States, there is a global clean energy revolution that is absolutely underway around the world. And so there's also an incredibly strong movement around the world of people who want to push leaders to have a more ambitious plan to protect nature and to protect living creatures. So highlighting the human action and also highlighting the technological progress is something that I've had to be really intentional about for myself as well as for my kids.
yeah, absolutely. And something that a lot of the parents of older kids, of teens, in our research said is, kind of when do we start having this conversation about climate justice and introducing kind of that piece where the conversation expands beyond, recycling, bringing your reusable water bottle, to more kind of larger, maybe transformative, collective action. And this kind of gets into it a little in our section for older kids between 10 and 18.
Yes, I'm so glad you brought that up. So climate action is highlighted several times throughout our updated guide, Climate Justice and Climate Action. And we really advocate that children can start taking part in collective climate actions at a young age. I've gotten involved in New York City with Climate Families NYC, which is led by Liat Olenek, who has two really young children, a baby and a toddler. We asked her to kind of come in and write our guide about taking action as a parent. But one of the things that's really cool about that organization is all of their protests are family friendly. So they have kids in strollers at marches, at rallies. They also have ways for kids to, draw pictures to send to elected officials. For kids that are a little bit older, fourth and fifth grade, you can already make phone calls and call elected officials. So there's no need to confine ourselves to individual climate actions like recycling and composting. It's always important to figure out ways to connect to the bigger picture because kids aren't dumb. I mean, they understand lots of things about big numbers and the idea that, well, I can help my little part, but also I want to be part of something bigger as well. So that is something that we advocate a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. And even younger kids, I feel like they have a real understanding of fairness, and justice is actually kind of quite important to younger
Yeah,
kids, like what is fair. And so that's kind of a good gateway into a climate justice conversation as
it
well.
absolutely is. Yeah. And I guess I want to jump ahead a little bit and as we're talking about this because we do have a section specifically for families that have intersectional identities, right? This is something we were asked about by parents. And the topic of climate justice, we understand that there are frontline and fence line communities that are impacted uh, disproportionately by pollution, by fossil fuels. And then there are just families that are affected by the poly crisis that's going on right now because of their immigration status, because they have queer family members.
Mhm.
So how does the climate conversation come in there?
Mhm.
Do you have any thoughts about that, Rachel?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, children, families of color are probably having, right, these conversations about justice and other kind of big, hard topics, perhaps at, a younger age than others. And this kind of the racism talk can kind of be adapted to fit the model of climate injustice. And we do have a link in the guide about linking to a specific talk around racism and structural violence that can be, a good model for introducing climate and the way that all these things um, are, deeply interconnected.
Yes.
And and another point of intersection that our guide talks about, we have a section dedicated to neurodiversity and how to kind of talk with, neurodiverse kiddos, disabled kids, kids that learn differently. And this is really important when, talking about climate disasters, for example, because it is often, disabled folks that are more impacted by disasters. Um, and for neurodiverse kiddos, the kind of routine disruptions that occur due to climate and extreme, weather may be more challenging to cope with. And so really having, a safety plan in which your children can really be a part of that and understand that, and having conversation of, hey, like because of the certain medications you are on, like your body is, affected differently by heat. And so this is what we're going to do to keep you safe, and really just clearly spelling those things out, and having your kids be a part of that, is really important.
Absolutely. So we have, research-based information from Elizabeth Bayshard, Emily Diamond, and also want to call out Dr. Jade Sasser, who helped us with our section on, families that face racism and discrimination. And, what's really important, I think, with this conversation as well, when we talk about families with intersectional identities or the climate justice issue, is also taking a strengths-based approach, right? So
Mhm.
we make the point in the guide that families that, for example, have, traditions of cultural solidarity, practices of mutual aid, queer chosen families, these are resources. So these groups, these identities, it's not just about the disproportionate impact of climate, but it's also about what are your strengths and what do you have around you to help your kid thrive? Well, if I have a stronger community tie or identity, that can be part of what helps us face the future. And by the same token, when talking about kids who are neurodiverse or who learn differently, inclusive climate movements are stronger climate movements, right? And the climate movements that are built by and for people with different identities are the ones that are really equipped to face the challenges of the moment. And so always thinking about how I think a lot of times with parents, we're in such a culture of toxic individualism that families really feel like they're on their own facing these challenges. But what I've seen again and again is that when families do decide to show up and make space, the experience is so life affirming, and there's so much connection and support that can come from that. And to understand that, your kid belongs there too, just because, it's very hard to navigate a world that's not necessarily designed for kids or kids like yours, but we all deserve a place. And so something like, for example, if there's a climate rally and you're afraid
Mhm.
it's going to be too loud for your kid, is there another way for them to participate? Or could you even ask the organizers to make a more accessible, action? And these are all things that are important to think about and include.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think something that I've has really struck me is just the power of like knowing our neighbors. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm just realizing how essential and crucial community is. And I mean, knowing your neighbors, I think, is so important in so many ways, but it's also, I believe, one of the number one like climate preparedness, strategies is
Is
is knowing your neighbors, knowing who lives around you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I'm going to skip back a little bit because, we did talk about one thing parents asked for was different kinds of diverse identities, how to meet them, and that's very much covered in the guide. We also have specific sections for different emotions that kids are presenting with. So we talk about fear, we talk about grief. We have a whole guide on climate grief, but this is a list of like very specific, concrete actions that we can take. But I want to highlight because I had a lot of, working on the section of anger, right? So what do you do if your child or teen is angry? And can you talk about a little bit about that?
Yeah. I think, you know, really focusing in on our anger and what feels unfair really translates into the values that you hold. Um, kind of, I think about how, often grief kind of points to what we love and care about, which I
Yeah,
believe Joanna Macy um, talks about in her work. And same with what makes us angry, right? We can really use this as kind of like a moral compass to give guidance
yeah.
on on finding ways to act together.
Absolutely. And, I think that the key thing to remember too is if you're if you're a parent or a caregiver or a teacher, young people might be angry at you, right? Because young people
Yeah.
are a most affected group when it comes to the climate crisis. You talk about climate justice, young people are frontline in the climate crisis. And so that might be uncomfortable, to confront that anger. It also might be buried under a sense of indifference or apathy, that, that's also really developmentally appropriate for teenagers who are just taking in so much of the world right now. And being a safe space for those emotions and really acknowledging the unfairness of it is something that I think it's incumbent on all of us to do, who have younger people in our lives, to be able to hold that space and to be honest about the fact that it's not fair, and that we could have done more, and that we are handing off to them a world that doesn't have the same promise that it might have had 20 years ago because of inaction. Yeah, I just think there's a lot of power in that.
Yeah, yeah. I think I grew up with a lot of anger, honestly, around kind of older generations of being like, how could you let us like inherit a planet like this?
Yeah.
Um, but I think, just understanding like everyone has been through their own struggle and journey around this, and that older generations have actually done a lot of work, like
Mhm.
history is not linear. And I don't know, I think we have to recognize too, like the need for intergenerational work and how it is really essential to be working with younger people, working with older people. We actually do have a specific intergenerational guide as well, which is another great resource. But I think, I relate a lot. This one parent shared this, she said, referring to her child, she has a lot of grief and a lot of anger, and it's not just at leaders, but at humans in general. She thinks humans have just like wrecked the life support systems of the planet. And I really relate to that. I felt that a lot growing up. And obviously we can hold all the feelings there and then also open up a conversation of, it's not all humans, right? And there's still really amazing people doing amazing um, work and really leading into their humanity and the humanity of others. But I think anger is such a valid and important emotion.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And just validating feelings in general is always something that we're trying to show up for as parents. Um, Now, while there's a lot of psychological advice in the guide, I do want to highlight that there's some very research-based information also about things like extreme weather. And there's a guide from Emily Diamond, who's done research about extreme weather. It's just one of the ways that the rubber is really meeting the road for a lot of families in terms of experiencing the acute effects of climate change. And so one thing I want to say, that, like, this is really important, right? That Emily, a point that Dr. Diamond made, that when we think about teaching children, we're thinking about having conversations, and a lot of this has been couched in that term. But the number
Mhm.
one way for parents to teach is by leading by example, and that's taking climate action in all these different ways. But I'm gonna go ahead and walk through this because she talks about, talk about your values as a family, show that your kids that you're prepared and have a safety plan, involve them in that plan. And then I love this idea of preparedness day. Can you talk about that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So having kind of a whole kind of system in place, a whole kind of slew of, so you have your packing your go bag and involve your children in packing their own go bags.
Yeah,
So really taking ownership of this process, um, keeping non-perishables in the house, asking what first aid or medication should be kept on hand in the home in the home in case of a disaster, um, making contact with friends and family that are willing to host your family for a few days. So just having everything ready, but Preparedness Day specifically is thinking about starting this tradition by, as Dr. Diamond describes, having a day that's set aside just for all that preparedness described above. So summers when there'll be more serious heat waves, right? More fires, and a kind of calm day outside of that season is a really good time to set aside, an afternoon to review and discuss some of these issues. She discusses like replacing batteries for headlamps, restocking the first aid kit, updating the emergency contact list, right?
yeah.
Um, and this could be a tradition, carried on, where it's like today's preparedness day and you
Yeah.
put on music, you make it into kind of a fun communal family event.
Yeah, I really love this idea. I love because anything can become a family tradition, and this is such a
Yeah.
positive way to do it. It also occurs to me that, there's a way to fold in preparedness. For example, if you have a family that is lucky enough to spend outdoor time, like a lot of this could fold into like, oh, we're going backpacking, so let's look at our gear, let's look at our first aid. My kid is doing a first aid course tomorrow, my 13-year-old, because they want to get jobs babysitting, but that's another way that they're going to feel more prepared, in whatever might come. So, there's the idea that there's things that can have, an immediate purpose in the present and then potentially another purpose in the future.
Mhm.
That's really the kind of the soul of preparedness.
Yeah.
Um, and then I want to connect that too. We also talked to Erica Solov, who works for extreme weather survivors, about what if you do go through an extreme weather event? What happens afterwards? And so she fled her home with her two young children, with her husband in 2021 from a huge fire in Colorado. They didn't even have time to put their shoes on, and they lost their entire house and everything in it. And Erica is a personally really inspiring person to me because she's rebuilt her life and she now works at this nonprofit helping other people, like communities of people, for example, the LA fire survivors. And she talked about the prioritizing of recreating their normal routines. So, cooking dinner together, playing their favorite games, meeting up with their neighbors, their former neighbors who were evacuated. They kept their son enrolled in the same school, even though it was a really big drive. That was something they were able to do. And so she says, in short, we modeled daily that one very scary experience would not take away our family's joy.
Mhm. It's so important. I've actually kind of witnessed my uh, my in-laws practicing this, who they recently lost their home
Oh,
in the Palisades fire.
mhm.
Um, and what I've seen is them really trying to kind of um, tap into new community. And that is such a source of joy. They were lucky enough to move into a new place really near family, which is wonderful. But like you're describing here, like cooking together, playing games, right? Establishing these routines has been really helpful.
Absolutely. And that's sort of the seeds of what some people call post-traumatic growth also, when people feel a sense of strength in relationships and confidence, even a bigger sense of faith and putting things in perspective. These are the silver linings after the very real losses that we're facing.
Mhm.
Um, and Erica's final tip, is to seek out other families and build community. And that's our final tip as well. We hope that you take a look at the whole guide, that you read through the sections that are interesting or important to you. And when it comes time to want to take action, the number one thing that parents told us is that they would like to talk to other parents about what they're going through, as well as what their kids are going through. And, a simple step that you can do is send this guide to someone else. Say, I got something out of this. Maybe we can have a conversation about it. There are a lot of places out there like climate cafes, the Good Grief Network, the Work That Reconnects, that are all bringing people together to explore these emotions. And you can do it yourself. You can start a peer support group with other friends, other parents and caregivers, to start the conversation going. It could lead to action steps like disaster preparedness or climate action, political action. That's kind of open-ended, but making sure that there's a safe space, because what I found is that, it's been a personal journey for me as a parent. As I start to dive into these emotions more for myself and for my kids, it's inevitably led to action.
Mhm.
And for my kids, knowing that we are active on these issues really, uh, it helps alleviate a lot of the anxiety, because they can sort of feel like we have got it and that we're handling it and that it's not a taboo topic. Um, and so I think that's something that in my family really helps keep the topic of climate change in a space that is open, and it's one of the things that we're dealing with as a family, and it's not buried where it can really fester.
Yeah, exactly. Um, yeah, I think just acknowledging the reality and not, I think a lot of times we think it's too scary and sad to have these conversations with children and young people. But the truth is, like, young people are experiencing it, they're feeling it. And so, why not really open up these conversations, which may lead to more connection and actually joy and community, you know?
That's exactly right. And meaning, right?
Mm,
Meaning and purpose. These are all things that are waiting for us, as we on the other side of something that might feel kind of scary.
exactly.
So thanks
Exactly.
for going through this with me, Rachel, and thanks for working with me on it. I'm so excited for people to get to hear it and to read it.
Yes. Thank you so much.
All right.